First, going to talk a little bit about why you would want to build an open source centric company. I have a lot to say on the topic. I'll get into it. I'm going to start by letting someone a little bit or a lot bit smarter than me articulate some of the primary reasons.
People say you have to have a lot of passion for what you're doing, and it's totally true. And the reason is because it's so hard that if you don't, any rational person would give up. It's really hard, and you have to do it over a sustained period of time. So if you don't love it, if you're not having fun doing it and you don't really love it, you're going to give up. And that's what happens to most people, actually. If you really look at the ones that ended up being successful, unquote, in the eyes of society and the ones that didn't, oftentimes it's the ones that are successful loved what they did so they could persevere when it got really tough. And the ones that didn't love it quit because they're sane, right? Who would want to put up with this stuff if you don't love it?
So to summarize, if you want to do something successfully, you have to be passionate about it. Open source is something that a lot of people, specifically technologists, have an easy time getting passionate about. It's challenging, it's rewarding, it's entertaining, it feels vaguely philanthropic. There's a really long list. So if you're in this room, you are presumably passionate about open source for one of those reasons, and that's why you're here and not next door. There were 2 points that I took from that clip. The first one, you need to love what you're doing to be happy. The second one, you need to love what you're doing to sustain it and to do it over the long term. A business's main goal is to stay alive over a long period of time. So to point number one, you need to be passionate. Point number two, you need to be doing something that can actually get you through the hard times. So we'll talk all about those hard times, but reverse a little bit, and let's talk about who I am and where I fit into the big picture. So I'm Leah. I'm the co-founder of a small company called Tilda. We build open source software, and we just released, probably a year ago now, our first product. It's called Skylight. It's a Rails profiler. You should check it out. And I do a lot of open source work. So the best run open source projects are a lot more than just code and coders. I spent most of my time in open source working on not code for open source projects, and to put it in terms that are hopefully meaningful to you guys, core team levels of involvement in many, if not all, of the projects that you see here. And people find that to be a little bit surprising. One of my main focuses right now is on Ember, and I've talked to a lot of you about different parts of what I do there. But people basically assume in order to be on the core team of an open source project, you have to be a coder. No such luck. I focused on what I saw to be the underserved areas of open source. I basically started getting involved in the periphery and watching my friends who are engineers be super excited and super passionate about this thing, and I was trying to figure out basically how do I insert myself into this equation in a way that's meaningful and useful. And learning to code, one of these days, it's on the agenda. But first I found sort of all these underserved areas that I thought I could bring skills and attention to. So I work on events, I work on logistics, I work on core team infrastructure, I work on evangelism. It's an important part of my general strategy of how to run successful open source projects. And I'll tell you a little bit about where some of these ideas came from. But first, in addition to working on these open source projects, I thankfully have remained employed. Most of the time I did this open source work on my spare time, but for a lot of the time I worked for companies that were open source centric companies and that supported me doing my open source work and supported me using company time for all the various initiatives that help these projects grow and be successful. I think most of these companies are still, well, when I was there they were open source centric, and when I left I was hoping they would stay that way, and I think they're all on various different paths. I spent about 5 or 6 years on the board of the jQuery core team and working on the foundation. That's where I first learned the lesson about having core teams that weren't just coders. It was something that John Resig did, I think, before he realized that it was a thing. And then over the years, as I jumped from project to project, I watched Yehuda Katz really help crystallize it for me as an actual strategy for making sure that your open source project is successful. It seems obvious. There aren't like many other professions where people are just like, oh, well, I am the maker of the bricks, and thus I don't need all the other people who will build the house, right? But somehow in code and in open source, I think it's because we have such power as engineers to just make things, to think them and then create them, that you can get into the mindset of like, okay, this is all we need. And in fact, if you want to be successful on a larger scale, you really need people with a diverse set of skills. So at jQuery, I mostly ran events. For a time, I ran the accounting department. Hopefully, your project never really needs an accounting department, but jQuery obviously got pretty successful. We had a guy named Ray Bango who ran this like tremendous evangelism organization. We had people who ran like the infrastructure organization. We had people who didn't really even write JavaScript in the first iterations, but who were just in charge of like our website and what it should look like. And really, you need all of those sorts of different pieces to make something be successful to the large scale of jQuery, and even like all the long steps away. So just to put some perspective on that, I was working on jQuery at a time when it was like John Resig in his basement with his adorable fat cat. And we would go to conferences and people would like laugh us out of the room and not talk to us because like prototype was it, and we were just weird. Like they were like, I remember this one like Ajax experience in Boston, like forever ago, and Yehuda, who was on the jQuery core team project at the time, showed up to like talk on this panel, and they were doing this like risque thing by letting jQuery on the panel because people were like, what is this weird new thing? And the prototype core team member on the panel would not shake his hand. Like he went over to him to be like, jQuery, and he was like, ugh. But we all know how that went, so there. So I worked today mostly on a project called Ember. It benefits from a lot of these lessons that core team members of these other projects and myself learned along the way. It's the open source projects that's the main focus of Tilda. It has a functionally diverse core team, and we have a funny, sometimes animated, friendly hamster. So basically everything you need for success in a project. We have a vibrant ecosystem. We have multiple companies scratching all the different itches that you could need. So there are training companies, consulting companies, people making screencasts, conferences. It's a really long list of players and roles that they're filling, and it's growing every day. And when we get into the nitty-gritty, I'll talk more about how we contribute to the ecosystem and how you need to sort of think about these other players in your ecosystem. Spoiler alert, it's not a threat, it's cool. Let them do their thing, be happy that they're there. So we talked about some of the like loftier reasons that you want to build a company around open source, namely that it will make you happy and you will save the world. But some of you probably aren't convinced yet. More importantly, even if you are convinced, you probably have to go back and convince bosses, stakeholders, investors, et cetera, that this might be a strategy likely worth pursuing. These people, unfortunately, don't just get like happy in their hearts at the thought of open source. And honestly, sometimes they just don't care at all because their jobs are oftentimes more about the bottom line and the cash flow and the really making sure that things don't shut down, which, respect, that's important. So I'm going to start by tackling some of the low-hanging fruit. So the top items on the list of how open source can help your company and some of the points that can help you get buy-in from others at your company. The first is expertise. If you are contributing to a project and your company is using that project to build your product, aka your revenue, you want to be building this in-house expertise. Depending on how involved you do or don't get in your project, this should easily mean the kind of expertise that later on down the line you would have to pay a lot of money for if it was even accessible to you at all. I mean, think about how much money you might need to pay to get someone on the Rails core team, someone on the Python core team, I don't know, DHH to come over to your shop and just like chill with you and talk about the architecture of your app, right? In many cases, it's just not even accessible at all, but in a lot of the other cases, you're just basically paying through the nose. So when you build this expertise in-house, you basically don't have to buy it elsewhere later. And aside from all the benefits of just being really good at it and building a good product, it makes financial sense. If you're contributing to a project and your company is using that project to build your product, it might also be nice to have influence over the future of that project. There's a lot of value in having a seat at the table, or I guess a voice on the internet, as it were, when the creators of these open source projects and the contributors are figuring out what's happening next, when they're figuring out what to prioritize, what breaking changes to make, which older versions of the API they should or shouldn't support, and that is pretty critical to your commercial success on the other side of the equation. For the most part, these open source projects are really looking for help, and they're super excited to have it. If you are smart, if you will work hard, if you're going to add value in some way, any way at all, really, then they're going to listen to you, and you'll be able to have influence. You'll have opportunities to sync up with the other influencers, and this can really sort of change and shape the direction of things all around for the better. Recruiting, this is not my favorite thing in the world, but it's really one of the easiest things to sell to the other internal stakeholders who aren't necessarily on board with something like this. Being involved with an open source project means that you know who the top talent for your stack is. You probably already have great relationships with them. It's the fast track, again, to being able to hire amazing people and to be able to hire people that you probably wouldn't have access to otherwise. The sort of people you would say, like, oh, that guy's awesome. I can't even approach him in a hallway. No, actually, you talk to him on IRC 2-3 times a week, and he would love to listen to you. And if he can't take that job, he's going to recommend somebody who can. There is basically a mass shortage of solid coding talent, and another spoiler, the internet is not going anywhere. Companies are paying recruiters crazy salaries, hundreds of thousands of dollars in referrals and placement fees. Being hooked into the right open source community means that you are a lot less likely to need to spend that kind of money. It means that you're going to hire amazing people. It's just an overall solid investment. Imagine if instead of spending $200,000 on recruiter fees, you spent it on some sort of amazing hackathon or like sponsoring the development of a portion of the project that changed everything and made everybody's lives easier. People will appreciate it. It will pay you back. It's a really good investment. This last point plays into all of the other ones. Building an approachable brand around, approachable, accessible, successful brand around open source is basically developer marketing gold. It's the kind of stuff that you can't really buy even if you had the money for it. Developers, at least in the Rails and JavaScript communities, which are the two communities I spend most of my time in, are really, really appreciative of people and companies who invest in the technologies that they get to use for free every day to make their businesses run. That means that they like you. That means that they want to buy whatever it is that you're selling. It basically means they want to help you as however they possibly can. And again, that's like crazy goodwill. AT&T Interactive is an example of a company that supported open source in ways that I approve of and clearly achieved a lot of the goals that you might have. They hired a number of years ago my friend Aaron Patterson. He's a gentleman who's on the core team of Ruby. He's on the core team of Rails. He wrote a project called Nokogiri. He's basically a loud, public, amazing, prolific open source guy. And I think it really worked out really, really well for them. I point them out specifically because they're even different sort of from companies like Tilde and the main sort of small company I'm talking about. They're a giant behemoth conglomerate. They were able to do things for open source, like they sponsored conferences and did things like that, but even just like having Aaron on the payroll working on open source full time, they were able to do things that on their scale, like barely, nobody even noticed. It was like the bottom line, nobody noticed that there was that one dude somewhere doing that one thing, and it really sort of changed everything for them. It's the reason I know AT&T Interactive exists at all. And if you've paid attention to the last like 5 or 6 years, there have been some really, really impressive technologists who floated in and out of there, and people who otherwise would pretty much laugh you out of the room if you talked to them about the idea of working for a company with like an AT&T, right? No, thank you. Aaron worked there for 5 or 6 years, which is also like actually pretty crazy in developer employment terms, right? You're lucky if you get sort of 2 or 3 years out of these people that you hire, especially if they're like amazing and brilliant, because they're like wanting to learn and grow and move elsewhere. But A, because he was just appreciative of what they've done, but B, because they kept doing it, he was just fine. He potentially could have stayed there forever. Okay, so we agree we want to go this route. I mean, you haven't left, so I'm making that assumption. We've talked about some of the basic benefit arguments. Let's talk a little bit about how you make it happen. So the first big question, funding, how do I pay for it? The funny part is when I first started writing this talk, I was just going to skip this part altogether because it's just like it's just not the most interesting, right? I'd much rather talk about, I don't know, open source company relations and keeping everybody happy and singing around a campfire, but it turns out people need money, whatever. So it's not the best outlet for my creativity, but on the other hand, I think that means that it's because I've sort of found a formula of different income sources that when combined make this work, because all of the companies that I've been at for the last probably 5-6 years now have done some sort of combination model of all these things I'm going to talk about, and they're all existing in some shape or form successfully. So we'll talk about some of those low-hanging fruit. But before I get into the specifics, I want to point out a theme in all of these ways that I like to raise and ways I don't like to raise money. My preferences lean towards things that are going to position your open source interests and your product/company interests, aka your revenue, together. The ultimate goal is to really have this symbiotic relationship where your project funds your open source work and your open source project helps your project grow and keep going. I couldn't find, when I was rehearsing this talk, I kept getting confused because I would say project and product, and even I couldn't follow, and I would say it wrong sometimes, but I could not find an alternative, so sorry. Basecamp is one example of doing this sort of thing. They use the development of their product to push Rails forward, and Rails allowed Basecamp to grow to this amazing place that it is today by giving it all the technology that it needed to build what it eventually became. There are definitely some small caveats to exactly how they executed the strategy, and I'll get into it, that I'm like, you could have done that probably 20% better, but it's pretty undeniably that this was a smashing success. They sort of did the right thing on both sides of the equation right enough to keep them symbiotic, keep them feeding into each other in this cycle that allowed them both to prosper and be successful. I want to talk first about things that don't work, and that's because if you don't have particular experience in this area and you sat down with a whiteboard and you just tried to brainstorm, how am I going to fund this company that's all about open source and helps me build this project, and I really think that the first things you would reach for on the list are probably most of the things that I would recommend against. So it seems important to tackle those first, maybe get them out of the way. Venture capital. Insert GIF of money and all that, right? Open source as a strategy is really playing the long game. It needs time. To be frank, it needs a lot of faith. And most venture capital or investor arrangements aren't going to give you enough time and enough runway to really see the fruits of your labor. They need quick wins, they need momentum, they need ROI that they can tie to specific spend. They need a whole lot of things that are absolutely reasonable, considering that you're playing with their money, but they're things that aren't really going to be easy to get in a strategy like this. And so that kind of aggressive progress and that aggressive level of risk-taking basically is a formula for frustration and ultimately failure in trying to do this. And there are actually a number of companies who sort of try, where they get the good guy VC on board, gives them that initial burst of cash, believes in open source, but pretty much inevitably, I don't know, even just 6 to 8 months down the line, he's kind of getting antsy and where my money? And at that point, you've basically thrown away his money, because investing 6 months worth of time and resource in something that's a 2 or a 3 year game and then getting out, you may as well have chucked it in the first place, right? You're not going to get anywhere. Donations, yay. So you think to yourself, I'm building this awesome thing. People use it. People appreciate it. They like it. They're going to help me pay the bills. Things like GitTip, things like putting a PayPal donation link on your website are cool, but they're not enough to really get you anywhere. You should definitely do them in addition to whatever else you're going to do to raise money, but you can't count on it for sustainable income. Even with jQuery, which had this giant level of success, we had a foundation, we had all the infrastructure to support doing this right. We had meetings to strategize about where on the website the button goes and how do we do this. We had drives where we specifically pushed for the donations. At the end of the day, it ended up maybe $2,000, $3,000 in a good month, which is really nice, but it's not paying for your business. It's not paying for your salary. It's not going to keep things going along. It's really, really hard. It's kind of not worth it in the long run. You should do it because there's a lot of satisfaction in some random person sending you $10 or $20 or even $100 over PayPal and writing in the comments oh, you've changed my life. And I say that with a accidentally sarcastic tone. This happens and it makes my day. And that's amazing, and you should do it, but it's not really going to get you anywhere, and so you need to do all these other things alongside. Next on the top list of things not to do. Support is one of the obvious things that people think is on the list, but it's really, really hard to make work at all on a small scale. You can do it when you're giant, if you're Red Hat, if you're Oracle, if you have these mass armies of engineers who are just sort of sitting around with extra time, and you can optimize the hell out of it. But on a small scale, it's not really going to work. And obviously, with all the things I'm talking about, I'm focused on that small to medium scale and maybe getting to a place where you can have armies of engineers, but all the time up until there, basically. So a couple of points on why I don't think support is a good idea. So the first thing is, as a small company with a finite amount of resources to put into whatever it is that you're doing to generate revenue, you really need to attach a pretty hefty price tag to support to make it worth your time. And that kind of price tag, along with the perceptions of you as a small company, really lead to the sort of relationship where your customers are trying to sort of squeeze every last dollar out of that support arrangement. And that, if any of you have experienced it, is not fun. Like, support as it is on its own is not really that fun. But when there's sort of like a mismatch in like how much we're giving you and what the value is, it's extra specially awesomely bad. The next thing is that running a support program really requires a lot more administrative overhead than a lot of other options. There's scheduling, there's like crazy complex sales, you need tools for managing your tickets, you need on-call schedules, you need shifts, etc. You need like a lot of mental energy and just people to optimize it. Like, you sell these hours, but what do you do when you're not using the hours? And so obviously you have to double sell the hours or maybe triple sell the hours, but then of course all three of your like biggest customers need your hour at the same time. And when it's just like three of you in a room, like there's really nowhere else you can go at that point to help alleviate that kind of stress, which leads to my next point about why I absolutely don't like support for a model like this. Support adds the complexity of this constant urgent need. And you really want to reserve that level of stress for whatever the real thing you're trying to do is, for your product, for things that really make a difference in your financial future. And lastly, selling support for your open source project really does put your revenue goals at odds with the larger goals of your open source project. If you need to make money helping people use your software, you're not really incentivized to make it as easy to use as possible. And then you're sort of not having the best adoption and the most success because it's not the best project. And you sort of end up in this weird conflict where you're incentivized to bake problems into your open source project, so that you have this assurance that people will need to pay you and you'll be able to keep existing. This is obvious for bad reasons. This is obvious. So I got a little tied up there. You should always make sure that you are incentivized to make everything that you're doing, and especially your product, as awesome and as successful as possible. Okay, so enough with all the things that don't work. Let's talk about some of the things that do. Overall premise, you want to float in and out of these various income sources as the money ebbs and flows, as the amount of attention you need to place on your product ebbs and flows, as the demand shifts. Early on in your company, and certainly probably even later, but especially when you're young and small, having only one source of income that you rely on is really, really dangerous. Basically, it means that if something goes wrong, you're out of business. So the safest bet is to really have a large number of income streams. So sort of even if one of them goes a little wonky one month, you've got these other things coming in and paying the bills, and it's never really end of the game disaster. You also want to be doing a diverse mixture of these sorts of income sources because it will help you avoid rabbit holes and tunnel vision, sort of getting too attached to one path and one problem. It'll give you a broader, more realistic perspective on the landscape. One of the first things I'll talk about is probably one of the better ways to make that happen, and that's consulting. So consulting has risks and rewards. I tell you from experience, the revenue is very addictive. It's the highest, it's the most consistent way that you can earn a high dollar amount per hour, and then it gets really hard to stop. I guess it's sort of a good problem. Maybe you should have so many leads that you don't want to turn it off, but if you remember, you're sort of also trying to build this product, and you need those resources for that. And consulting really requires you to keep focused on these clients for long periods of time with numerous resources, possibly all hands on deck, and this is typically at the expense of your product. That said, you should definitely do consulting for all the reasons I talked about. It will broaden your perspective, but the way to do that most successfully is to make sure that your consulting projects aren't just generic, whatever anybody will pay me to do, but ideally you find people to pay you to work on the open source project that you are invested in. So if your project is Rails, you should do Rails consulting and not necessarily Python or something else or whatnot. It will keep you in touch with the real needs of your users, and it will help you have the experience of building apps that are very different from yours. Ideally, you would slowly shift some of that stream into training. This is something that will come into play as your project gets more and more successful, but as the demand grows, you should ease into it. Training is really nice. The revenue comes in bursts, which means that you don't necessarily need to take these long sustained periods of time away from the other things that you're trying to do. You have to like make that initial investment, of course, to build your curriculum, or 3 or 4 curricula, but once you do, you can sort of like drop in, do 3 days here, do 2 days here, and get that burst of revenue that might otherwise take you a couple weeks on a consulting project to get. Personally, I'm a fan of sort of the small, high-priced, intimate setting type trainings. Like, put a nice price tag on it, but make it worth paying for, where people have access to these experts that they otherwise wouldn't be able to get in a room with, wouldn't be able to ask a personalized question to. The alternative is obviously like you get a giant room, 500 people, you charge them a lower amount of money, but it adds up and it's a lot more of the generic experience. You should probably do both. I like the first one better, it's more fun for me, but doing a mix of those, again, will help diversify the income sources and help make sure that you're sort of getting everything that you can possibly get out of the arrangement. Events scratch a number of important itches. They're funding, but they're also important community building. Community is a really important, larger part of the plan to have your open source project be successful. If a community is invested in your technology and your success, your whole company is going to be invested in your success. It's very infectious and it's publicly visible, and it puts you in a place where you don't want to let people down. The goodwill of like building something and putting it out there and having people use it and love it is highly addictive. It's pretty amazing, and making sure that you have these opportunities to like come into contact with it and remind you how important it is and that what you're doing matters is really, really important. From the perspective of lead gen, having a successful community and having an in-person community will feed leads into all the other funding sources that we're going to talk about. It makes your presence real life, and it makes it not as dependent on like how good you are at search engine optimization and things like that. You can go out there, you can meet people, they will tell other people about how awesome you are. Events are also just revenue. Conferences absolutely can make money. You just have to be smart about it. You need to not take giant risks. Like most things, you need to start small. You need to avoid like overcommitments, and conferences are like something that get a bad rap for being a money sink, because a lot of people make really, really expensive rookie mistakes, like you get in a bad contract with a venue or a caterer or a hotel, and then not only have you not made any money, but you've taken like you're on the hook for like $50,000 or something. It's scary. This happens all the time. If you know what to look out for, you shouldn't have these sorts of problems, and events are absolutely a really great way to make money. You should recognize that the more of them you do, sad face, it's going to be terrible because you're going to sell out and you're going to be disappointing people. Good problems to have. Last point, because this is a tactics section, just to make sure that we're covering the actual sources of income related to events. There's admission tickets, there's sponsorships, there's trainings and workshops. In my history, the most successful events are ones that sort of optimize a blend of all three. Get it? BlendConf. I made that joke in my rehearsal, and then I was like, well, I remember it, that was good. Clearly, we could see what type of sense of humor I have. So you want to do a mix of all three, at the very least 2, and those are going to lead to the best bottom line events. Reminder, focusing on sustainability. These are all funding sources where if you mix them together appropriately, they should keep the money coming in from a whole bunch of different sources, keep it flowing. There are absolutely better things to do if you want to run for 18 months and have a time of your life and crash and burn. Like, then get VC, absolutely. Hire above your means, take over the world, do whatever you want. Those aren't really sustainable things. They're not what I'm focused on today. Okay, so we talked about why you want to do this. We talked about some of the benefits of doing this, or more importantly, the ones that you should use to convince other people that they should do this. And we talked about some of the ways to fund it. Let's talk about why it's going to be really, really hard. So emotional ups and downs. Basically, as you achieve success with your open source project, people begin to rely on your software and they start wanting more from you. So a quick hit list of things that you want to keep in mind. You need to be really, really careful with setting expectations. People are absolutely going to hold you to them, and more importantly, they're going to hold them against you when you don't do that. And open source projects are, everybody wants everything from you. But if you do a better job of clearly communicating what it is you're actually going to deliver, and then delivering it, it gets better and better and easier, and people know that they can rely on you, and people stop having these crazy, unrealistic expectations of you. You need to not be afraid to let other people help you. I touched on this earlier, and I talked about Ember, and I talked about how we have all these other companies involved in the ecosystem. As the company like supporting X project, you really don't want to own all of the pieces of the ecosystem. You want other people doing consulting, events, training. It's really just more evidence of your success. It's making the pool bigger. It's having all these other armies of people who now it's their job to help evangelize this technology that you're invested in. And you're just not trying to be a giant monopoly, right? Like, we don't want to be one of those. The healthy ecosystem is the one where you can have 5 training companies next to each other and try not to punch each other, but it'll all be okay. You want to track the successes. The internet is rarely a representative sampling of how everybody feels. And as it turns out, the grumpy people are typically a lot louder than the happy people. You also want to be able to sort of let people know that you're regular people, that you're successful. I think I skipped a transition. I did. Okay, this tweet is from a friend of mine, Evan, and he tweeted about how if you are worried about what people are saying about you and the thing that you're working on, just look at this. And if you follow that link, it links you to a page with a bunch of commentary from the original announcement of the iPod. My favorite, I poop, I cry, I was hoping for so much more. And if you read through that, there's a lot more. This is the worst idea ever. What is Steve Jobs thinking? This is never going to go anywhere. Ha, ha, ha. Clearly not. But the point is that, like, you need to, in this moment, Steve probably felt pretty crappy. And that would have been an important moment to, like, have a list somewhere to whip out and be like, no, I did this, I did that, I'm good at this is worth doing, I need to keep moving. And then I guess keep the bad ones around also, because they're good for comic relief later. So, meeting people. This is where I was going. The internet is not a representative sampling. I got a little caught up there in my notes. The meeting people is what will help you convince that they don't all hate you and that they appreciate what you're doing. And again, you want them to know that you're regular people. You're not just like some mythical concept on the internet. This will help get them invested in your success and help them want to support you even more than all the other things that you're doing. You want to stay above the fray. This is really, really hard. You want to not engage in the nasty online competition. Ignore it. It's really hard, and sometimes you have to respond, I guess, sort of. But if you do, you really need to do it in that impressive way. The one where you're like, some people look at the exchange later, and they're like, I would have punched the guy. But the way that you handled that was really, really good. And you should surround yourself by people who do this, and if you're not actually particularly good at that, surround yourselves by people who will hold you back when you want to punch the other guy. And by punch him in this case, we mean like send that tweet where even a week later you're like, oh, I mean, I was angry, but that was just not cool. Pro tip, maybe don't read Hacker News so much if you're going to be on it, right? Like, those are the sorts of things that will drag you down and suck the life out of things. So lastly, this is a universal principle. Take time away. Gain perspective, whatever that means for you. Sometimes that means spending some time in another community. Sometimes that means spending some time on a beach. Whatever it is that you need, make sure that you do it. Everything that you're trying to do when you're trying to achieve success and get something adopted, both your project and your product, everything's going to feel urgent, and everything's going to feel like if I don't do it right this second, I might miss it, and I'm not doing enough, and all that. And it's sort of true. But it's true, right? It's always going to be true. So you need to like take a step back sometimes. You need to clear your head, go other places. And those are the times when you're probably going to come up with the best ideas. You'll come back refreshed, and you'll come back with new insights that you wouldn't otherwise have had. It's hard to like walk the tightrope between being frugal and being cheap. You need to realize that most of the things that you're spending money on in this sort of strategy are just not going to translate directly to leads. So you need to make sure that everybody else is on board with that. Before, after, in the middle, remind them along the way. I can't tell you, again, like that good-natured VC, how many good-natured VPs of marketing or whatnot will be like, oh yeah, I get this. This is so philanthropic. We're going to save the world. Go to this conference. Talk about how awesome we are. And then you get back and they're like, oh, by the way, give me the Excel form with all the leads that you collected. And you're like, yeah. And even if I collected a list, I don't want to give it to you. You're going to like spam all these nice people who now like me, and there went the end of that. So it's hard. And again here, set expectations correctly, and it'll be better. There are a couple of areas I like for making sound investments, though, in marketing and in evangelism and in the like subconscious lead gen. The first one is sponsorships. By this, I don't actually mean events in this case. I mean sponsorships of sort of smaller code initiatives. You might be able to get a lot of goodwill out of donating maybe just $500 for some person to like fix this bug that's really been bugging everybody in your community and annoying them. And once you get bigger, you can do things like larger grants and initiatives and whatnot. And this is a really, really awesome way to build goodwill, to spend money in a way that will feed back into all your other leads and make everybody like you and your project, more importantly. Swag and branding opportunities, there's sort of like, I should have put it on the slide, but there's like a big red asterisk after that, which is like not crap. Not everything that you could stick your logo on should have it. Most of those things probably shouldn't exist. The other types of opportunities, other than like things that you can give out, are the like branding opportunities where, hey, I will support XYZ, and you'll get up on stage and you will talk about how awesome I am. So as it turns out, there's no shortage of people willing to take your money in exchange for saying nice things about you. So if an opportunity doesn't seem clearly awesome and clearly correct and like it will be handled well, don't do it. That like stress ball, probably no one's gonna like it very much. If you found like an awesome idea for something that people will take home and share and use, if you found someone who's gonna get on stage and like talk about you in the right light and not make you seem evil, by all means do it. But again, those opportunities are all over the place, and so you don't need to feel the sense of urgency to take them every time, and you can be very picky and choosy. Lastly, I like investing in user groups and smaller events. And by this I mean other than the ones you're running, because you absolutely should be running them and doing everything you can to bring the community to you where you are. But user groups and smaller events, again, a similar thing. You can send $200 to a user group in the middle of some place that you might never even go and really change everything for them. And like maybe they want $150 to get pizza, and you give them $200 and they get to get sandwiches, and it's just like, wow. You have made everybody incredibly happy. You have spent this tiny amount of money. And this is probably another good place for the like rolling in the cash Scott Hanselman animation, because you can like make it rain everywhere. Like you can send $200 to like 10 people and like, wow. And everybody's like, oh, they're everywhere. They're just supporting everybody. And you've done something like that in a way that's small, that's not gonna put you out of business, but that buys you a lot of goodwill, buys you goodwill in like a personal, there's only 50 people in the room and they know who I am kind of way. So I'm a big fan of that. There's no list here. Don't be the evil corporate overlord. If whatever you're doing makes you seem like Sun, like Darth Vader, like anybody that you might put in a list with those guys, avoid it. So with all of the things that I talked about doing to make money, you really, really need to take a light touch. You need to follow the path of, if I provide value, then people are going to want to support me rather than I have money, so I will buy the time and shove it in their face, right? That's not gonna go so well. If you have a speaking opportunity, talk about your open source project. You should absolutely, in your bio, kind of like I did, mention like, oh, this is what I work for and this is what we do. But you should make sure that the main thing getting you the attention is something that has merit on its own. And then sort of at the end of your talk, people are gonna be like, oh, well, that person had really good things to say. I'm gonna go investigate what they do. And oh, maybe that's something I should buy or fund or whatever it is. You need to make it clear that you're passionate about the open source itself, and that it's also just not just a vehicle for your product, right? We've all sat in those talks where it just sounds like sort of someone's shilling for something, but they put like this little thin see-through piece of paper in front of it, and they're like, don't look at the man behind the curtain, right? Bad news, don't do that. Surviving while you're gone. And what I mean here is that you need to make sure that your project is gonna keep going and keep thriving when you take 3, 4, 6 months to work on your product. If you're heads down doing anything else and your project falls apart, that's bad, but that's also actually the case with a lot of things, and it's the case with a lot of projects that sort of disappear. And the first thing that I'm gonna talk about is how you make that not happen, which is you need to be building leaders and not just community. This is similar to like letting other people make money in your ecosystem, which is like let go a little bit and it will be better for you, even though it's a little bit scary. Feeds right into the next point, larger, give up some control. You need to be helping develop these other leaders, and having other leaders in your community that don't work for your company absolutely means that they might every now and then do something that wouldn't have been your choice. You should view this as a good thing. The mixed perspectives are gonna have a profound effect on your ability to be more broadly successful. They're gonna make sure you have a better project. You should follow the BDFL, benevolent dictator for life types of model, rather than the like tightly controlled dictator who approves every commit and every change and all that. Reminder that, like consulting, it means that there's these people who are not gonna have the same goals as you involved, and that's totally cool, and that will help you maintain this broad perspective. Make sure, basically I like to say, make sure there's not too much you in your open source, and that it can apply to a lot of other people and a lot of other needs, and it needs to stay general purpose. If you remember earlier when we talked about Basecamp, I mentioned that there were some things about how they did this project-product relationship that I didn't love, and this is that thing. DHH pretty much expressed a couple of different times that like Basecamp equals Rails and vice versa. There's a blog post he wrote called The Parley Letter, which talks about, which touches on some of these topics in a way that I didn't love. You want to have a symbiotic relationship that we've been talking about, but that's not the same thing. And thinking that they are the same thing can lead you to a bad place. You need to not have that sort of tunnel vision. There were people that were turned off. So let's be clear. Obviously, Rails was successful, and DHH is like filthy rich, and more power to him. They did well. But for the most part, most people actually don't get away with that level of hubris, and it turns a lot of people off. And you want to not do that. That will be happier, everybody will love you, the end. Stay general purpose and have a symbiotic relationship. Reminder here again, you need your product, your project to feed into each other in a slightly less intense way than we just talked about. So let's summarize some of the things that we talked about. Let's wrap it up. Number one, the goal is happiness and sustainability. Number two, you have all these in-house perks to doing all these things. You have expertise, you have recruiting, you have people that you can hire. It is a financially wise move to pursue an open source friendly strategy, and it's also going to be awesome. You should have diverse funding sources. This will protect you from tunnel vision. This is going to protect you from big silly blows to your bottom line, especially early on if something happens to go wrong. You need to keep your goals aligned. This is a lot of what we talked about in the support section. It's pretty easy actually to go down a route like that and not realize that you've gotten yourself into a place where like your left hand needs to punch your right hand to keep going, right? So you need to always be careful with that and evaluate your goals and make sure that they are aligned on both sides of the equation. Lastly, again, think about sustainability in everything that you do. I focused a lot on things that you should be able to sustain in the medium to long term. I think building businesses is really hard and amazing, but hard. And in my mind, the goal is not to get from like point A to point B to point C as fast as humanly possible. It's to get to point Z and still be alive and hopefully happy. So thank you.